Here's everything you need to know about the Arab-Israeli conflict in 15 minutes or less. This is just the basics, so please don't attack me in the comments. I know this is very, very complicated. And if I want to explain it in detail, it will take weeks. But basically, if you don't know a lot about the conflict and you want to know the basics, the headlines, basically, watch this video and you'll be fine. What we know now as the Middle East doesn't really exist until quite recently, relatively speaking. So the Middle East was just part of the Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years. The Ottoman Empire lasted between 1300 and 1922 after the First World War, where it lost. It was part of it and lost. And what we know now as Palestine or Syria or Lebanon or Jordan were all parts of the Ottoman Empire for, I think, about 400 years. So what happened after the First World War is that the Western imperialist countries went and found a way into the Middle East, and they divided the Middle East into various countries that they basically decided which country, which Western country takes which, and by Western countries we mean Britain and France. So France and Britain divided the Middle East, and they created the countries in the Middle East as we know now under a treaty called Sykes-Picot. So Sykes-Picot is a treaty between Britain and France, in which they decided to divide the area into separate entities, separate countries. So France took Syria and Lebanon, and Britain took Egypt and Iraq and Jordan. So what happened is that in 1917, the British foreign minister, I think, Arthur Balfour, gave the Zionist movement a promise. So first, the Zionist movement had been there for a few decades by then. It started in 1897 by Theodor Herzl, and they were lobbying and being quite active, trying to convince the British government to give them a place in Palestine. So in 1917, they were granted that by Balfour himself, and it was called the Balfour Promise or the Balfour Declaration. Okay, so this is basically how Israel as a state started. It started with a declaration by the British Foreign Minister Balfour. So as we said, Arthur Balfour was the British Foreign Secretary, and he gave the declaration, the promise to the Zionists that Britain will help them establish a state in Palestine. And that's basically the story of how Israel as a state started. So what happened is that when the British had a mandate over Palestine, the Jewish migration from Europe intensified, and many thousands of Jews started moving into Palestine and buying land there and settling in there. That was somewhat tolerated, and of course, naturally, the more intensified this became, the more resistance it was faced with. With the rapid increase of Jewish migrants into Palestine, their own entity started to grow and grow, and they started forming their own militias and their own institutions. And by the time it was 1947, the conflict was clearly present and urgent. So the UN came with what was called with the UN Partition Plan of 1947, in which the UN decided to divide Palestine into two areas, one governed by the Jews and one governed by the Palestinians. The Jews were given 56% of the land and 43% was given to the Palestinians, and that did not make the Arabs happy at all. There was a lot of resistance, and that resistance culminated in the War of 1948, and in which the war was called, in Arabic it calls the Nakba, or the catastrophe. And what happened is that the Jewish forces basically won the war and established themselves as a state. The Arabs tried to push them back, force them out of Palestine, and that did not happen. So the formal state of Israel basically started after 1948 in the war of the Nakba, or the 1948 war. So what happened after that? Of course, there was a lot of tensions, and many wars erupted ever since. The first one that happened after 48 was the War of 55 or 56, when Egypt decided to nationalize the Suez Canal. There was a war. The French, the Brits, and the Israelis together attacked Egypt in order to prevent it from nationalizing the Suez Canal. That war ended, and ended with the failure of these forces, and Egypt was indeed successful in nationalizing the Suez Canal. The war after that happened in 1967, and it was called the Six-Day War, in which basically the Israelis achieved quite an impressive victory, quite a decisive victory, and the war was so fast and so effective, so efficient on the part of the Israelis, that it took only 6 days, and therefore it was called the Six-Day War in 1967. The 1967 war, the Six-Day War, is perhaps the most important war in the history of the conflict, because that war was so decisive and the victory was so big for Israel that it actually managed to more than double the size of its existing territory at the time. Basically, in 6 days, Israel managed to gain the whole of the Sinai Peninsula. In Egypt, they took the Golan Heights from Syria, and they took the West Bank from Jordan. And Israel as a country was even more established, and that was easily Israel's biggest victory in the whole history of the conflict. What happened after 1967 is that the Arabs were quite adamant to kind of gain some of their dignity back after these horrible defeats that they suffered. And they basically planned, the Egyptians and the Syrians together collaborated and planned a war in 1973. That war is called the October War in the Middle East. In Israel, it's called Yom Kippur War. And in that war, basically, the Syrians and the Egyptians managed to gain some kind of victory. We can easily call it a limited victory. And in which Syria gained, a little bit of land, and it was the same case for the Egyptians as well. But then things kind of developed quickly after 1973, because the Egyptian president of the war, of 1973 war, Sadat, decided that he wants to have peace with the Israelis. So what happened is that Sadat went to Israel and decided to have a peace process with the Israelis, based on which the Israelis will give him back the Sinai Peninsula in exchange of peace with Egypt. But when it comes to the Palestinians, the conflict there was still quite complicated, and there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of mini conflicts, a lot of resistance. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, grew a lot under the leadership of Yasser Arafat. And the PLO, under the leadership of Yasser Arafat, decided in 1993, after a lot of negotiation, to have peace with the Israelis. What happened is that the Americans kind of decided to intervene with the leadership of President Bill Clinton, and Norway was also involved in what was called the Oslo Accords. And the first Oslo Accords were in 1993. Okay, so it was like a declaration of principles for peace. It was signed between Israel and the PLO. The PLO was basically seen as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. And it was very significant because it set a framework for negotiations that aimed at resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and achieve lasting peace. So that was Oslo Accords in 1993. Of course, that took time. It was not the end of it, because, as we said, it was basically just a set of principles. Later, there was the Oslo Accords 2, and that was in 1996. And it was basically just to further what happened in Oslo Accords 1 in 1993, okay? And the initial agreement was like dividing the West Bank into 3 zones and designating varying degrees of Palestinian self-rule and like combined with Israeli control. So it's like a mix and match, basically, depending on the area. So you can see already that it was quite complicated and it wasn't going to be easy or simple to understand. Okay, now I will put here a map to see these territories and how they were different. Okay, so today the Oslo Accords somewhat failed, mainly because the conflict is quite complicated, and like even though the Oslo Accords outlined a framework for a two-state solution, the construction of Israeli settlements in Area C, as you can see in the map we put, continued, which lead to contested claims over land and complicating the prospects for peace between the two supposedly states. And in reality, the Israelis didn't really want to apply the Oslo Accords. This is something that I mentioned in a previous video. Like you can see a leaked video from 2001 in which Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, the current prime minister of Israel, and he was also prime minister before, between 1996 and 1999. So he talked in detail and quite clearly about the fact that they were not interested in doing the whole Oslo Accords, and they encouraged the settlements and they redefined what they called military bases in order to evade the application of the Oslo Accords. So the whole situation is quite complicated, but basically the PLO tried to make compromises, but these compromises were not good enough for the Israelis for complicated reasons. So as it stands today, the Gaza Strip, Palestine, as we know it, like the Palestinian areas, are basically separated into two. You have the West Bank and you have Gaza. The West Bank is ruled by the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and the Gaza Strip is now ruled by Hamas. So keep in mind that the PLO is now basically known as the Palestinian Authority. So the PLO basically evolved as it took control over the West Bank and signed treaties, the Oslo Accords and what else. They basically transformed into being called the Palestinian Authority, and they made something that resembles a state in the West Bank. It's far away from it, but it somewhat resembles it. So we have now basically the West Bank, East Jerusalem. These are basically belonging or somewhat relevant to the Palestinian Authority. And you have the Gaza Strip that is under the control of Hamas. So the most contentious geographical area in the whole conflict is actually the city of Jerusalem, because you have both Palestinians and Israelis making claims over it, and because it has a lot of the holy sites over which both the Palestinians and the Israelis fight. That area is quite complicated. So East Jerusalem, for example, includes the old city and the holy sites for the Jews, Christians, and Muslims, right? And that area was captured by the Israelis in the 1967 war. So we have to keep in mind that it's not only on the outside borders of Israel as we know it, and it's not only on the outside borders of the Palestinian Authority as we know it, that we have most of the conflict. We have also conflict within cities itself, and mainly the conflict over Jerusalem, which is the biggest of all conflicts. This is basically a quick story of the Israeli-Palestinian, Israeli-Arab conflict made short. This is basically all you need to know to be able to discuss it with your friend at a bar. But if you want to go deeper than that, then I would highly suggest you do your own research, because this thing is very complicated. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.